Hello, welcome to Revive and Rise. I'm your host, Melody Parrish, and I want to take a moment to thank you so much for spending your time with us today. I have a special guest that is going to talk to us about the immigration situation at our border, and that is Will McCorkle. He is the professor of education at the College of Charleston, and he works at the border with Practice Mercy, an asylum seeking association that deals with women and children at the border. And welcome, Will. I want to thank you so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Great. I want to talk about several important things because this is a very hot button, important topic with so many different changes going on at the moment. But first, can you tell our listeners what the difference is between immigrating to a country and seeking asylum?
Yeah, it's a good question. They're definitely interlinked, but there's some clear differences as well. Um, one thing that historically people could just kind of immigrate, and some of them would be people that were in very desperate situations that had to immigrate. They would be like modern day asylum seekers. Some were more immigrating for economic reasons, and there wasn't necessarily a distinction between the two. It was fairly open immigration system, and that changes a lot, especially in the early 20th century in the U.S. There's a lot of restrictions on immigration, and so they especially in the 1920s, they just really restrict immigration for everyone across the board, but especially those from Asia, um, Africa. And it wasn't until World War II, and we saw the horrors of the Holocaust and everything that was happening there, that we realized that our lack of um, giving people a chance to seek asylum or refuge had really led to the deaths of all these people. And so, both internationally with the United Nations and in the US, there became more of a realization we have to allow people that are fleeing from countries um, where they're being persecuted, where there's active war and violence going on, that they can seek refuge or asylum. Now, uh, the big difference between like refugees and asylum seekers, sometimes there's a lot of misunderstanding about that. Refugees usually have to apply in your country, or a lot of times it's through the United Nations. So you think of like people that fled from Syria to Turkey, for example, and they're trying to go someplace else and they have to be processed by the UN. And we do receive some of those. It's a fairly small amount every year. Asylum seekers, on the other hand, like are they go to the border, or they're in the country. Sometimes you might fly into the country and say, I need to seek asylum. So someone that actually comes to the border, comes to the country, and that is how most people have been coming into the country, is trying to come through the asylum system. Now there is some caveats and some nuance there, because there's people that are fleeing because they're in great danger. There's people that are fleeing more for economic reasons, um, but because there's not many visas for those who are for working class migrants, it's almost like the asylum system is the only way that people can come in. um, but even that has become a lot more restricted over time, and over the last couple of years it's shifted pretty dramatically.
Yes, and our asylum situation, that is legal, and I think that sometimes our listeners and people generally in this country, they don't understand that this is a legal process, and it's very controlled because they have to answer all these different questions and explain all these different things. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, so it's a long system. Now, a lot of people that have been coming in recently, they're here temporarily, like on humanitarian parole, and they actually haven't been granted asylum because there's a lot of cases, there are not enough judges. So sometimes they won't have a case for 3 years. And unfortunately, a lot of people will be denied. I would say the majority. Part of it depends on where the judge is at, what the political ideology of the judge is. So it's better for people to seek asylum in Boston or New York than it is in Atlanta or Charlotte. And so that's it is a long process, and yet unfortunately, they people just use the term illegal immigrants to describe not only people that are legitimately here undocumented, but people that are in the asylum system. I remember during the presidential race that question was asked to JD Vance, and he's basically like, well, they were saying that the people from Haiti, most of them are here legally. He's like, well, I don't agree with the system they came in, so I'm going to call them illegal. It's not the way it works, but
Yeah.
they just kind of throw that term out there because I think it scares people or it makes people angry when actually most of the people coming in now are not actually here. The government knows they're here. So it's not the same as maybe 15 years ago when people were mainly trying, like just coming into the country being undetected, and they were actually here unauthorized. People that are going through the system now are, they've been processed by the government. Now, unfortunately, if they really put more restrictions on the immigration system, which I think is coming soon, then most people will have to really be coming in completely illegally or being unauthorized immigrants because um, there won't be any pathway to come in legally, or very few.
Right. And, I've been to the border with you twice, and both times it was just very different. I saw these people that and the way they lived waiting there at the border, and it's really heartbreaking that these people are seeking safety, but yet they're made to wait in these conditions that are not, I mean, in my opinion, it was a severe humanitarian crisis there. Um, as far as the way that these people were living, it just didn't seem right to me at all. And I would hear the horror stories of why they were fleeing. Can you explain when you say say that there it's their safety reasons? I don't think anybody in this country could understand what that means.
Yeah, I think and each situation's different, but there's a lot of people. What we're seeing is kind of shifted what countries people are coming from. At time, it started off with a lot from Central America. Then there was a lot from Haiti and Venezuela, some and Russians as well. It shifted back more to mainly people from Honduras and some areas of Mexico, actually, that are very known to be very violent regions, cartel controlled, a lot of gang activity. And so a lot of times children are being forced to join gangs. You know, from the case of Haiti, right? I mean, I don't think anyone legitimately can say, "Oh yeah, Haiti is a safe place." Like it's right now just probably the most definitely the most dangerous place in the Western Hemisphere. Like probably one of the most in the world. And so, if people can get out and flee, I was talking to someone the other day and said that people just would they're just trying to take rafts to get to any other islands. And it's harder for them to migrate because since they're on an island. But yeah, there's a wide range of issues like that. And then in cases like, Venezuela, a lot of times it could be political repression. They're being targeted politically, or it's just the economic situation so rough that they're having a hard time supporting their family.
Yes, yes. And I remember the second time that I came, it wasn't that long after the fall of Haiti, and there were so many Haitians there that were just so desperate. And I think that is what really had an impact on me, that these people were so desperate. I remember going into Catholic Charities to volunteer for a couple hours and just seeing the blank stare on these people, and they didn't know what to do, or some of them couldn't even speak the language. They can't even speak English, but they're stuck here, because at least here it keeps them safe, right? Is
Right.
that correct, what you've seen?
Yeah, I think there's the security is a big reason for this. And just being able to have a life for their family. And I think, there's a lot of it too. Rightfully so, it's increased the last couple of years just because there was seen as like this is kind of a little window that if you're going to come, you better come now. And that's caused a lot of fluctuations in the immigration system. Um, but yeah, I think there's a lot that's just people that are um, there's a story of a guy who he came into the US from Haiti the first time, got deported back to Haiti. And he said I think like the first week he was there, he was driving around. His cab driver got shot right in front of him, like while they were driving around. Like, and so just like that level of instability, um, that anyone's going to want to get out of. And so, um, when people demonize people that are leaving, it's it's really unfortunate because usually they're some of the most desperate and also um, a lot of times the most resourceful people, right? They're actually usually the people that are going to like do whatever they can to get out of that situation or like try to make a better life for their family. So usually when they come here, right, they're not coming to just sit around and do nothing, right? They're really trying to make a better life for themselves. And so that's what they call it, like the immigrant advantage is that oftentimes, we actually, as much as people demonize immigrants, like usually you get some of the most like driven people from another country because they're willing to take that kind of risk and journey to get here. But that's also mixed with a lot of times just a desperation.
Yeah, yeah. And I remember being at the border and just listening to the stories of the travel here and how dangerous it was. And I just remember thinking, wow, what what kind of desperation are you in to withstand all of that? Just for and not even to know that you're going to actually come here and get into the country, but just have a chance.
Right. Yeah. I mean, it's a lot of the Haitians, they weren't original. They were in South America before, and so they had to go through the Darien Gap. Same thing with Venezuelans. So it's this extremely long journey for the chance to possibly be able to stay. Um, and so, especially people that made it all that journey to now not even knowing. There's, right when we were down there this last trip, a lot of people are just saying like, what's going to happen after Trump comes into office? Like, what's going to happen with us? Because a lot of them have now been waiting there like, you know, some have been waiting up to 10 months because now everyone has to go through this phone app, which is good and bad. Like I think it streamlines it. It makes it it kind of cuts out the cartels a little bit. It's more through the government. It does limit the amount of people that can come in. Um, but people have been waiting there trying to come through this app. And then there's this fear, this realization among some that, as soon as Trump comes in, he's probably just going to shut that down as well. So there will be basically no way to legally to obtain asylum. So their options are either going to be going back to the country they're from, or which oftentimes is not an option, or trying to cross illegally into the U.S., which is going to mean really strengthening the cartels because the cartels will make more money. it's going to be a lot more dangerous because they actually have to be not detected by Border Patrol, which means they have to go through extremely dangerous areas, through the desert, the brush. And then once they get here in the country, then they have no way to actually legalize their status. They're basically just going to have to stay under the radar, maybe their whole lives. And so, unfortunately, that's kind of where we're at. And the demonization has worked, unfortunately, with a lot of the American public. And I think we're going to see that it's going to have real negative consequences for migrants. And I think it's going to have negative consequences for our society as well. Like, as much as people like to, it was amazing that, people just were railing against immigration when, in a lot of ways, the increased immigration under Biden was probably the thing that helped stabilize our economy more than anything. They didn't, I don't feel like they necessarily were able to express that well. They never made that point, which always frustrated me. Like, they just didn't want to talk about immigration, but you're like, look, why don't you ever talk about the positive benefits that this has brought to the country? Not that that's the primary reason that you're letting people come into the asylum system is for their economic benefit, but it did have that effect on our society.
Yes, yes. And that's the thing. For some reason, it's been pushed. They're taking away our jobs. They're taking away our housing. It's like these things are happening and we have to blame someone. And so, for some reason, immigrants have been chosen for that. And can you push back on those things? Because you've witnessed firsthand and you're very, very involved in immigration in so many different ways. Can you talk about that and push back on those things and ideas that people may have?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of just cognitive dissonance or disconnect there because, I'll give you like Elon Musk for an example, right? So he'll talk like consistently about how the birth rates are going down in the U.S., which is true, right? That people are not having as many children, and so like our population actually is declining in numbers, and so the natural, response to that should be, okay, then we must need to increase immigration. But a lot of times, people like him and others will push back, and they don't want immigrants to come in either. So it's like the whole idea that they're taking jobs doesn't make a lot of sense when there's like a labor shortage in many areas where our the actual population in the U.S. is not increasing, like people that are native born citizens. Um, and so, and I think economists would say that across the board, even conservative economists, that yeah, this is a positive for the nation. I think what it drives a lot of it is more, and people aren't not going to usually say this. They're gonna put it in economic terms, but it's this fear of the cultural changes or the racial demographic changes in the nation. I think that's what's driving people like Elon Musk and Trump, right? It's economically they know. I think someone like Musk has to know that economically this is a benefit. There's benefits there, but there's this cultural, racial, nationalist fears, and unfortunately, people will just they'll point to one example. Let's say there's a legitimate example of an immigrant committing a crime. They'll point to that. They don't want to talk about the statistics because the statistics on immigrant crime, they're usually much lower than the U.S. citizens, and so they just create this narrative that we're in danger. There's fear, and someone who hasn't even met an asylum seeker in some other state far from the border is obsessed with immigration when there's so many other issues that are actually affecting their lives in negative ways. Like, and so it is something where we're really just it's horrible policy. I guess it's good politics. It seems like, and sometimes it's good politics to demonize people. Like it seems like it might win some elections, but as far as actually the economic realities and what it does to our society, we're benefiting pretty greatly from having people come in. And I think we'll see some of those issues arise if we do really shut down the border. That's going to negatively impact things. We're going to have more of a labor shortage. We're going to have inflation could go up, food prices could go up. All the things that Biden was blamed for, that it could really affect inflation. That's just if they shut down the border or they make it more difficult for people to enter. If they actually try to do mass deportations or something like that, then that would decimate the economy. Which is, so I don't, that's why sometimes I don't know if that stuff will actually happen or not. But just when you're running on a platform of fear and hatred of the other, then, and the crazy thing is, in a time of untruth as well, if you do that and the economy collapses, they'll still, certain media outlets will still turn around and blame the immigrants somehow for causing it. So when people aren't tethered to reality, you can just create whatever narrative you want. And so, unfortunately, that's kind of where we're at as a nation. I think there's a lack of like basic social and economic understanding. Not to get on a rabbit or go off on a tangent, but you could just see that lack of understanding about the economy. It came to the last election, people were like, "I don't like Biden or Harris because of inflation," and you're like, "What? What are the policies that lead to inflation? What's inflation like around the world?" Just like basic economic understanding is lacking, and so when you're in that type of situation, it's very easy to manipulate people and cause fear. And unfortunately, especially for migrant populations, they're going to be the most negatively impacted by that.
Yes, and talking about economy, you know, I was just dumbfounded because, I have friends that work financially, like with different parts of the world, changing US dollars to euros and other currencies. And they tell me how strong the US dollar is worldwide. It's stronger than it's ever been in the last, I think they said 10 years that they've been working. And so to get this idea that the economy is doing so poorly because the price of eggs is high, or you go to the grocery store and things are a little more expensive or a lot more expensive. That's just misinformation and ignorance about the economy and how the world works, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think there's just um, and some I think it's just they don't want to understand, but I think there's also just people are so uninformed that they just it's an easy answer. And I mean, I will say, like, if the economy collapses under Trump, I think he would go down, and not that he's very popular now to begin with, but he would go down even more because people tend to just blame the president, whether the president has to do with it or not. But I do think, and things like housing, for example, has gone way up, but a lot of that was because of COVID, and part of it, was honestly because of the the lack of immigrants that came in under Trump and during COVID. That immigrants are more likely to be in the construction industry, and so, I mean, that was another thing. Go back to what JD Vance said. There's one point he's like, immigrants are causing the housing crisis because more immigrants are coming in. Where you're like, yes, immigrants are moving into housing, but they're also like more likely to be involved in construction to do new housing. Um, and so it's something where we're actually, that could be another thing where housing could just become more of an issue. And I think that's the thing that's also driving a lot of this. I think it's just the being upset with housing costs, which kind of just has dwarfed a lot of other things, and not realizing that the solution is actually letting building more, letting more migrants come in rather than restricting the people that are working in the industry because I'm guessing 70% of the construction industry are people that are unauthorized immigrants, undocumented, or people that are seeking asylum. And so, um, yeah, the things that people actually are angry about with the economy are usually caused by the things that they're also like trying to stop.
Yeah, yeah. And it's so bad that, these people are just getting blamed for things. So when I was for example, when I was delivering groceries for the food bank, I would go to houses of immigrants, and they were in trailers and trailer parks. They were not in houses. They were not in apartments. So really and truly, they're not taking the housing that we're blaming them for.
Yeah, yeah. By and yeah, they're a lot of times they're living in trailer parks or living in very they're renting out a room, and so they're not even taking as much housing as other American families would take with the same family size. And so I think it's something that there's a woeful lack of information on, or I mean, there's information out there, but it's um, who's controlling the narrative and who's controlling what people think. People um, letting that fear take over, and it's a good group to scapegoat. It's more seen as legitimate to scapegoat certain group of people based on their immigration status. That seems as more legitimate somehow than if it was about um, their racial status or other areas, right? I mean, that
Yeah.
might be underlying a lot of it, but you can't say that openly as much. Or they feel free to openly just say horrific things about immigrants.
Yes, yes. And just from when I was at the border, talking about the racial aspect, it was easier for people that looked Caucasian, that were maybe from other countries, but in Europe, but they looked Caucasian. It was a lot easier for them to get appointments and for them to get visas, for them to seek asylum than those that had brown skin or black skin. Would you say that you see that at the border?
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure I think that happens probably on a more subtle level, as far as favoritism goes. And definitely in ways that, like, if it's a white family, they're going to receive more support or acceptance. An interesting story. There was a group. This was after you were down there. This was, I guess, I think earlier this year. Um, that there was a group of Russians on the bridge in this town called Progresso. I don't think it's like this little touristy town that's in between Reynosa and Matamoros. And there was one girl there who spoke English very well. She had been an English teacher in Russia, and so she would hear these conversations, these American tourists that would pass by, um, and they would pass by this group of refugees from Russia. And she remember saying at times people would be like, "Oh, you're fine because you're white." So I think there's like that idea. Now I don't know if it's like I don't think with the app necessarily it's based upon like racial category so much, but I think there's probably definitely ways in how who gets assistance or when they actually go before a judge. Um, that's where those racial biases really come in. So it's not like a stated legal policy, but I'm sure that would come into play a lot, right? When you have one family from um, Russia, or I mean, you did see a lot with Ukrainians. Now, I mean, there was different situations there, right? Because it was there was at least a short time where there was a lot of outpouring and support for Ukrainians, and so I remember at one point they opened up a whole bridge just so Ukrainians could enter. Um, and it kind of exposed what was going on in the immigration system because this was back in 2022, and I remember there was a news story came out about how um, Ukrainians were not, they were stopped at the border. People lost their minds saying, how are we going to stop Ukrainians from coming into the country? And so they let Ukrainians start coming in, but it kind of opened up this idea of like, oh, this is what we're doing to everybody else. Um, and on that point, I think there was some pushback to Russians by some of the politicians saying, oh, Russians are trying to come into the country. Or same thing with Chinese immigrants coming into the country, almost this idea that they're here to attack us, when you're like, no, at least in the case of the Russians, like 90% of these people are fleeing because they are against Putin, right? They're not fleeing because they like Putin and they want to become secret agents in the US. And so there's just this fear. Like, I remember, I think Lindsey Graham was like at some point, like, oh, these Russians are at the border, like this kind of creating this fear. And you're like, these are people that are like political dissidents or enemies of Putin, which of course, like now with the new president, maybe that's not, maybe he does with a closer relationship with Putin. That actually is one thing that does concern me a lot, which is probably one of the most vulnerable groups are some of these Russian migrants who have spoken out and they're still in the asylum system. And I would hope and pray that we wouldn't send them back to Putin, because, um, I think that would be just like a direct political, I mean, they could be killed by Putin or imprisoned. But at the same time, like with Haitians, right, it might not be that some of them might have exact, they're fleeing from a specific thing, but it also could be just like, if I go back to Haiti, the chances that I'm going to get killed in the gang violence is extraordinarily high. Um, so I think just inconscionable for us to deport people back to, I mean, to many of these countries, but especially Russia, Haiti. Um, Same thing with Venezuela, right? Where the same politicians that will talk about how horrible the government is in Venezuela, that we need to put sanctions on them, that they're destroying their economy and their people, will then like ironically be some of the same people that are like the most hostile towards Venezuelan migrants coming. So you're like, it's not even a thing. Like in the past, there would be governments the US supported where they acted like they were good governments and people fleeing from them must not be legitimate migrants. They must be like dangerous. But it's this really crazy thing when now people from like Cuba and Venezuela, governments that the US says that they are against and are bad, and they try to come to the country, we're deporting them now. Like it's a very, very strange situation.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense. And it's kind of counterproductive, right? I mean, you say it's bad, but yet you won't let people come in. So what are they supposed to do?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I don't know what it's been harder for them to deport people from Venezuela or Cuba because there's not the diplomatic relations between the countries. Like can't fly, the US doesn't like fly people back to Cuba. I don't think for the most part. There might have been some. Um, but I think Trump and them have been talking about basically just deporting people wherever they feel like deporting people to. Um, and so they might be from Cuba, but we're just going to deport them back to Guatemala. Or we're going to deport them to Honduras. It doesn't need, like, it's almost just this thing of we'll just kick them out of our country. They'll go someplace else.
Yeah, kind of like they're objects, not human beings.
Right. They have no agency. Yeah, it's a very dehumanizing thing.
Yeah. Um, and now I kind of wanted to touch on the topic of the mass deportation because that's a pretty serious thing. When you're talking about mass deportation, what exactly does that mean? And I feel like people don't realize what that's going to do to the economy. Like you said, they're they're like, "Oh, we need to do that. We need to do that." But do they really think that that comes for free? because it's thousands of dollars per person to send them back to their country. So why not just let them stay here and be productive citizens?
Yeah, that one's a hard one to know how much of it is talk versus, actual plan. During the first Trump administration, there actually wasn't that many um, deportations compared to some other, even other administrations. But that seems to be even more of a focus now, and that's going to be a harder thing to do. I think it will be. I think it will go up. Let's say that things like someone's driving without a license and they get pulled over. Maybe now, in a lot of cases, it's like they have to pay a fine. But if they really try to implement this, especially states that are working closely with Trump, like South Carolina, right? It might be easier just to like, okay, now we're going to arrest you for not having a license. We're going to deport you. The actual raids going into places, I think that could happen as well. Trump's even threatened to send in the military. I think at that point, if he does that, then we're living in a fascist state, right? And so the thing I think everyone needs to watch out for is how they'll use immigration as a way just to gain more control. They'll use, if he tries to send the military out saying we have a state of emergency or we need to use emergency powers to do this, that's not just a thing to go after immigrants. That's a thing to basically put down an authoritarian control. Um, I was just talking about this with someone the other day. I was like, thank goodness something like another September 11th or something like that didn't happen during Trump's first term. Like all of this has happened, and it's just they have to point to like one example of one Venezuelan killing one American citizen. Like, can you imagine? Let's say there actually was a terrorist attack, or let's say that, and let's say, God forbid, that even an immigrant carried out a mass shooting, which is 90% white men. But let's say at one time it was an immigrant, like how much they'll use that to justify just doing more and more fascist tactics. And so that's, I think, what we really have to look out for is that they're going to use immigration as a way to basically just take away more freedoms from the American people, gain more political control. And it's definitely not small government, right? I used to always hear this thing about conservatives saying that they like small government and they don't want government interference. You're like, this is as big a government as you come, like basically trying to control everything with who can work and who's allowed to live here, and going through and taking this strong stance on everything. It's the ultimate big government stepping in.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And you bring up the government. I know that you work a lot with legislation and different advocacy things for our immigration system. Can you talk to our listeners about how we can help in this situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is, a point of encouragement. I think, I always point back to when Trump was doing the child separation policy, there was enough people that were protesting. It got such a big issue that even Trump kind of backtracked a little bit, because they're like, this is not, um, it was an election year, it was midterm elections, and I think some of his allies were like, this is like, we know you don't like immigrants, but this is too much for the American people. And they shifted the policy. They shifted to something else that wasn't great either. But I think it's showing that if there's enough public outcry, people actually focus on it. Um, that I think even Trump, there's things that he might back down from. I mean, because I think he does have these very, very right wing tendencies, but he's first and foremost a narcissist. And so, like, he might, that's his number one ideology. So, like, if he feels like it's hurting him too much, he might shift. But I think, unfortunately, a lot of people just I've kind of seen an attitude of just like a lot of people just giving up, and I understand that because it's like, okay, we're doing this again. Like I'm just almost like an idea of like, let's just let the the evil and xenophobia destroy itself. Which I understand. On one hand, I understand that, but it's also like there's a lot of people that are going to get hurt along the way if you just kind of sit back and do nothing. And it might not be a thing where I think what people also have to realize is not maybe not a thing that it just ends in 3 or 4 years, right? Like you allow that, you just kind of sit back and let it happen. Eventually, it will destroy itself, but it might take 20 or 30 years. I mean, I think that's what people have to be really careful with. It's because you see with a lot of authoritarian governments throughout history and even in the modern day, sometimes they stay in power a long time. And it might not be Donald Trump specifically. He's almost 80 years old, and constitutionally, he's not supposed to run more than 2 terms. But if people don't resist and people don't push back, um, there can be that cement of power of people that are very anti-immigrant that could continue on for decades if we don't. And I think another thing that really important is for good or evil, like so much of our immigration policy is just in the hands of the president, which is not a good way to do the system. I do think we have to be really pushed back to make sure that there's not like a lot of anti-immigrant laws passed. Is one Trump's going to put in anti-immigrant executive orders, and some are going to be enacted. But if we allow like really anti-immigrant laws to be passed, then it's going to be hard. Let's say in 4 years we still have a fair and open democracy, and someone who's more pro-immigrants elected, they might not be able to actually do anything if they've passed laws that have made it more restrictive. So I think, and in that area, I think there is ways to push back. I mean, there's in the House of Representatives, right? There's a 4 vote margin for the Republicans. It's a very small amount. There's only a few in the Senate. Um, and I think part of it is for people that are, that lean maybe more centrist or center right to appeal to maybe more centrist Republicans that this is really bad economic policy. This is going to hurt us. And those who are more progressive to really get the Democratic leaders to care about immigration. The Democrats have largely, I think that was a huge mistake they made this last year, is that they kind of tried to act not quite as restrictive as Trump, but like, they would just say, we're for border security as well. There was no positive narrative about immigration. They didn't want to touch it. They didn't want to talk about it. Um, and I think, unfortunately, that's what's happened then, is that it allowed the anti-immigrant narrative to become the supreme one. So I think getting Democratic leaders and politicians to actually start saying, no, you need to stand up for immigrant communities. I think we've seen a little bit of that, right? I was thinking like the mayor of Chicago was complaining about all the asylum seekers coming in, which, I mean, there were some legitimate issues of too many people coming to one place, but then you can see like automatically this shift now when Trump talks about mass deportations. All of a sudden they're like, no, we're going to defend immigrants. So hopefully there is that shift and people start realizing that we've gone in a bad direction with all the xenophobia.
Yeah, definitely. And so, one thing, well, a couple things we could do then, you're saying like to write letters to our Congress people and our representatives and just get the word out, and use our voices as people of this country.
Right. Yeah, I think that's a huge part, getting involved locally with advocacy. I mean, I think about when a lot of these policies were like the child separation, when there was just protests across the nation. And I think people, I know it's like this tiring thing, right? To be like, we have to do this again. Like it is like, especially like deflating this time compared to last time. I think just because you're like, we did all this, tried to overthrow the government, Now nothing held to him, and now he's back in office. And I think there's a lot of like, especially with people in power, and I think this is where how fascism takes over. I think there's a legitimate fear, right? They're like, he wants to be a dictator, and we're gonna kind of walk with eggshells around this because we don't want to be the target of something. But that's how authoritarianism wins, right? When people start just giving up their freedoms and their freedom of speech and their ideas before they're even attacked. Like sometimes they don't even have to like attack them if people have already given them up.
Yes, definitely. And it is a legitimate fear in this country.
Yeah, no,
So,
I think this is the time more than ever just to be like, no, we're not gonna do that.
yes, yes, definitely. Well, Will, I want to thank you so much for being with us today and sharing your experiences and your knowledge with us. And please come back anytime to give us updates from the border and to give us updates on laws or your work. And just to mention, you are associated with a great organization called Practice Mercy. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we've been on the ground since 2019, working with asylum seekers in the cities of Reynosa and Matamoros, right across from South Texas. Giving spiritual, emotional support, trying to help people out, also with some of their physical needs, and um, and also a big part of our work is to advocate for migrant communities. I know this podcast might not get out before then, but we are going to do one big like vigil and walk the weekend of Martin Luther King weekend, that Saturday, right before the inauguration. And so we're trying to get as many people as possible down there at that time. And so if I don't know, again, this might might come out after that, but if it if not, if you're interested, please let me know. It's uncertain what it's going to look like in the future as far as our trips go, just because it's going to see what the situation looks like at the border. But in some way, we'll probably still be having people come down.
Okay, and that if you, I would love for us to get involved in this walk and vigil. That's so important. Um, And we need to, if you can go to practicemercy.com and
.org, yeah, practicemercy.org.
practicemercy.org and find out more information about this wonderful, wonderful organization and the work they do.
Well, thanks again for having me, Melody, and um, yeah, feel free to you're welcome to put my my email in the podcast description if anyone wants to reach out to me and talk.
Oh, fantastic. Okay, well, thank you so much, Will, and thank you for your work.
Okay, thank you, Melody.
All right.